Mr. Adam Skeptic made a response video to my video, Creationism versus Evolutionism. His video was titled, What exactly is evolution? I hope to answer his question in this video.
To be clear before I continue, I would prefer if you do visit his channel to be as polite and reasonable as possible, something I failed to do initially in our interactions on Twitter, and as a result it almost stonewalled the discussion.
I thought I would respond to this even though he's not making a point. I would just like to say thank you, Mr. Adam Skeptic. I really appreciate you saying this at the beginning. A lot of people don't watch till the end of the video, and hopefully anyone that was inclined to come over and leave a rude or hateful comment decided against it, knowing that you wouldn't have approved of it. Let's continue.
As my regular audience can see, there is a lot to unpack here. Setting aside for the moment that the existence of God is irrelevant to evolution,
I wanted to address his claim even though it was not elaborated on. I would agree that you could believe in an abstract version of God and still believe in evolution. However, if you are a Christian and you believe that everything the Bible says is the literal word of God, as I do, it is clearly relevant to evolution. God describes creating each animal according to their kind, as seen in Genesis chapter 1 verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. There you go.
We need to start with the usage of the word kind. I've covered this before, but it bears repeating here. The word kind is a problem because it has no equivalent label in taxonomy.
My counter-argument is that this is not a problem. Evolutionary taxonomy is incorrect anyway, so it doesn't surprise me that there is no equivalent label. I believe that taxonomy needs to adapt to the creationist viewpoint of kinds as opposed to us adapting to theirs.
There is a reason we bring up bacteria, fruit flies, and my personal favorite, the Galapagos Finches. Yes, when we say they are different species of finch, we are aware that they are still finches. Evolution does not demand that they turn into something else the way that you might think.
Okay, so here's where my biggest issues lie. Evolution actually does claim that a creature can become one of a different kind. Example, science claims that dinosaurs became birds. If you don't believe me, I will leave a source for this in the description. This is a quote from the article. Quote, "It is an unlikely relationship, but the humble pigeon is a direct descendant of the group of dinosaurs that includes the mighty T-Rex." So evolution actually does claim that a creature can turn into something totally different. Birds are not dinosaurs. You may believe they used to be dinosaurs, but it is an incontrovertible fact that dinosaurs are not birds.
The examples you cited of crossbreeding a dog and a cat or a horse and a cow is not what evolution is and would break the law of monophyly in particular. Such a thing happening would disprove evolution and not be evidence for it. Let me explain.
Before I let you explain, I want to say this. You are not accurately representing what the article was saying. The article was not talking about crossbreeding. It was talking about one kind becoming another kind. Basically, it's saying that we've never observed a cow becoming a horse, and we've never observed a dog becoming a cat. So how can you claim that a dinosaur became a bird, or that a fish became a monkey? That is what evolution claims.
This is where monophyletic clades come into play, but before we get to that, I need to cover speciation. So let's take a look at Berkeley University Evolution 101. To start us off, we need to clarify what evolution is properly defined as. Evolution, at its most basic level, is changes in allele frequency, better described as descent with inherent genetic modification, meaning that each generation is slightly different than its ancestors. You are not a carbon copy of your parents because of recombination of genetic material in the reproductive gamete cells, along with an average of 120 mutations that are unique to you. These alleles determine your physical characteristics, such as eye color, skin tone, height, body size, etc. Now, I am fairly certain that you're having issue with the whole mutation thing.
I don't have an issue with the idea of mutations. This has been observed and I know that they exist. My issue is how you define evolution. Let's listen to it again.
Evolution, at its most basic level, is changes in allele frequency, better described as descent with inherent genetic modification, meaning that each generation is slightly different than its ancestors.
Now obviously this is a fact. Of course I agree that diversification of kinds happens over time, when they are separated from each other for whatever reason. However, I disagree with this definition of evolution. Evolution claims that millions of years ago an amoeba formed spontaneously in the ocean. Eventually the amoeba became a fish that grew legs and walked up on land. The legged fish grew hair and became a monkey. That monkey is the evolutionary equivalent of Adam from the Garden of Eden. So you would think with such a ridiculous claim that evolutionists would provide some evidence that led them to this conclusion. But we see none, because there is none.
And even the ones that do have some effect, whether they are good or bad, are generally suppressed by recombination with other sexual partners within the population, so it takes time for any noticeable change to become apparent. Notice that I'm using the words generations and populations. That is because evolution happens to populations and not individuals, a point I need to make very clear. Evolution doesn't work like popular culture has generally described it. X-Men, Star Trek, and other pop cultures that try to implement evolution into a storyline wind up getting it wrong in some way, usually horribly so.
So basically in this clip you talk about how evolution doesn't happen to individuals, it happens to generations and populations. I don't know if you know this, but that actually makes evolution less plausible. Why is it that large groups all evolve similar traits, but some decided not to? A large group of monkeys decided to become humans, but some decided not to for some reason. And I understand that you claim that evolution happens over a long period of time, but isn't that convenient? But I really want to address the part where you say that most forms of pop culture get it horribly wrong. I think that movies and TV shows represent evolution for what it actually is, so I disagree that they are horribly misrepresenting evolution. Let's continue.
As an example, let's look at the Galapagos Finches. I'm going to summarize a bit here, but the ancestral group of all these species wound up on the archipelago about 1 million or so years ago. Yes, I can hear you protesting, but give me a minute here. We have a lot of information to cover, and I will be getting into how we know that in a bit. All of this is actually relevant. Now, the finches wound up in a pretty sweet situation. An abundance of food with no natural predators, since they were effectively an invasive species at the time. They soon spread unrestricted across the whole archipelago, but ran into another issue: competition for food. This is where the first working mechanism for evolution discovered comes into play: natural selection. There was a strong pressure introduced to find uncontested food sources, which is where we get the different beak shapes in particular on all these finches. Some beak shapes and sizes were more suited to certain types of food, so they started feeding exclusively on those sources. Since evolution works on populations, they started mating with those finches that shared their food supply because they were nearby. This is an important point. When you separate a population by geographic barriers or sexual preference, that suppression of mutations that we talked about earlier is relaxed, which accelerates the diversification and emergence of these big shapes, forming a series of ring species. There are degrees of separations that we need to cover here. One group may be interfertile with neighboring groups and produce something that looks like a hybrid of the two. However, if they are not sexually preferred, they are a different subspecies because of that separation and lack of interest in breeding. If they remain separated and isolated for long enough, they are no longer interfertile and move from a subspecies to a new species.
A majority of this I have no problem with. In fact, this bit was actually the most interesting out of the whole video. I think that this happened almost exactly how you're saying it did, except of course for the part where you say that it happened over millions of years. It is the next point that you make that I have the biggest problem with.
Yes, they are still finches, but evolution does not demand that it become something its ancestors were not, nor does it demand that the ancestral group go extinct.
Okay, evolution actually does demand that it become something that its ancestors were not, unless you're willing to concede that dinosaurs did not become birds and fish did not become monkeys. The problem I have with evolution is not the mechanism itself, it's the fact that it claims that all life came from a single-celled amoeba. Where did the amoeba come from? And how did the amoeba become all of life that we see around us today? Those are what my problems are.
A clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants, living and extinct, and they are nested in parental sets. The way that we determine these common characteristics to define clades is through a few methods, such as morphological character analysis, embryological development, and genetic sequencing, all of which I will go into more detail on if you wish. Using this image from this end to that end, and bearing in mind that I am omitting literally dozens of named clades, we can see that we are, for example, animals, because we are multicellular organisms with a digestive tract that must ingest and digest other organisms to survive. If it describes you, it defines you, to put it as simply as possible. Within that parental set, we have another daughter group that we're going to be moving into in the middle part of this image. We'll use vertebrates for this one because we have a spinal column. And for the last nested set, we are mammals because we have body-wide hair follicles and mammary glands specifically, along with several other traits. If you go down any of those other paths, you end up describing something else. Even AIG has to admit the existence of clades, and to their credit, have tried to make their own cladograms in a study called baraminology, with the root of each clade being a single created kind which is unrelated to anything else. The problem is that every time they try to show this or that is unrelated, we can show that they actually are.
So I decided to look into this myself. I went to Answers in Genesis and read what they had to say about clades. Here's an excerpt from the article I read. The link to this article will be in the description. As a result, modern classification is now changing into a largely dependent technique known as cladistics. Because of a pervasive evolutionary mindset, a new dogma has emerged. It is a concept summed up as common design equals common ancestry. In other words, if creatures share similarities, then it's presumed they have a common ancestor in the past. Within a created kind, where the animals indeed are related, this method can be advantageous. When creatures are not related and share design features, problems are introduced. So the universal belief that common design equates with common ancestry isn't always the best. Hence, most creationists often appeal to the more logical mantra of common design as a result of a common designer. Cladistics examines arbitrarily selected character traits, arbitrarily assigns values to them, and attempts to build a family tree for a given set of organisms based on statistical similarity. It separates these organisms into groups called clades, forming what is called a nested hierarchy. Nested hierarchy in particular is frequently cited as evidence for evolution, yet it is built on arbitrary assumptions. Now the reason I have read this is because I think they make some interesting points. Just because two creatures look similar, or just because they have similar genetics, that does not mean that they are related. I really like the part where they say common design is a result of a common designer. This article pretty much sums up my opinions on clades, so I'll leave it at that.
Right. So I checked your source, and early on I see this, which is accurate. See, the definitions you list don't define what species are, as in Homo sapiens, but it's how we identify species. This is a key distinction. What you have listed are how we identify those divisions. Take, for example, the first one that you list, typological or morphological species. This one is where the layman can recognize the same taxon, like Canis lupus familiaris, the domestic dog, or Felis sylvestris, the house cat. This is where we get that whole dogs produce dogs thing that creationists inevitably throw out in discussions. It's a very broad method of classification dating back to Linnaeus, but defining species goes a bit deeper than that.
Alright, you are correct on this one. However, the main point I was trying to say is still accurate. There are still 7 distinct definitions for a species. I will be reading an excerpt from this article about the species problem. Link will be in the description. The species problem is not unique to virology. Since 150 years ago, after the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, biologists still did not agree about what constitutes a microbial, plant, or animal species. Although the term species is used as the lowest category in all hierarchical biological classifications, what a species actually is, namely its ontology, remains an unresolved issue in the philosophy of biology. Marr declared, "There is probably no other concept in biology that has remained as consistently controversial as the species concept," and in 1997, during an international conference of species, no less than 22 different species concepts were discussed. In this excerpt, it talks about 22 different species concepts, but they don't explain what they are, so I'm just going to stick with 7. The reason there's so many different definitions is because it is difficult for scientists to define what a species even is. A kind is very easy to define. If two creatures can breed, they are definitely the same kind, and if they share a common lineage that can be actually proven, then they are also the same kind. Now, it is true that two animals may not be able to breed and can still be the same kind, but for the most part, a kind is very easy to understand. Let me give you an example to bring this point home. A horse, a donkey, and a zebra can all breed with each other, but from the evolutionist point of view, they are still not the same species. Why?
For example, Linnaeus himself could not find a character trait showing man was not related to apes, and demanded the scientific community of his day to show him one.
I can present to you some of the differences between humans and apes. Apes have lower intelligence than humans, they are covered in hair, they have tails, and they're much more physically stronger than us. They don't use language or currency, and they can eat raw meat. Those are just a few off the top of my head.
What followed is a perfect example of science being a self-correcting process. See, what happened was that being unable to face the fact that humans are apes, a point that I will cover in more detail in point 6 next time, the scientific community created a separate class called Pongo, where they shoved all apes except humans. Obviously, this did not stand up and was eventually fixed much later.
In my mind, that was a perfect example of how if you keep repeating a lie, eventually people will begin to believe it's true. I think they had it correct the first time. Human beings are not apes. If what you're saying about science is true, that it is a self-correcting system, hopefully they realize their mistake and accept the truth once again.
I realize that this particular point may be, well, difficult, but the word species does have a clear meaning, and the methods used in identifying species are what are being defined here.
Okay, so do me a favor. Define for me what a species is. Are donkeys and horses the same species? What about lions and tigers? If you can't even identify a species, how can you possibly define it?
At the risk of sounding condescending, though, sources like this are an okay place to start research. Peer-review articles and studies are obviously preferred.
I'll be making a video about my thoughts on peer-reviewed articles in the near future, so subscribe if you want to be notified right when that comes out.
I have made my point here, but if you want, let me know, and I will cover each of these definitions and what they mean in greater detail in a follow-up, but we need to continue.
It's okay. I understand the point you're trying to make, but I still stand by the fact that defining species isn't so easy. That is why I trust the Word of God. The Bible lays out a clear definition for a kind, and it is much more of a consistent definition than science provides. It is likely even if science comes to a consensus on what a species is, it would only be a matter of time before they change the definition again. But to answer your question, I understand that you have a huge backlog, and I think I got the point you were trying to make.
Yes. The evolution is not science thing. But to be blunt, and at the risk of sounding rude, Fierstein is not an authoritative source on what science is, let alone what evolution is or how it works. You seem to have allowed yourself to become encased in an echo chamber, which is part of what I am here to deal with.
I take your point about Josh Fierstein not being an authority on science. That is fair. But as for being in an echo chamber, I have had a social media presence for about 2 or 3 weeks. I've only met one person who agrees with me on some of this stuff. He's a very nice guy, but the only thing we agree on is the earth is flat. He's an atheist. I've not met a single Christian, at least in terms of talking about Christianity, on the internet. Now, part of that's my fault. I have not done a very good job at promoting my channel to other Christians, but the point I'm making is that I'm not in an echo chamber. I wish I was in an echo chamber. A majority of the people who subscribe to me disagree with me on almost everything, so I disagree with that characterization.
Your layout of the scientific method is mostly accurate, but I need to address a couple of important points here, and we will use your example to do that. Setting aside that the question, am I a monkey, is indeed a valid, if broad question, we need to come at this more incrementally and start with something like, are humans apes? Since apes are, at the very least, morphologically similar to us and us to them, this covers doing background research as well, which also looks at the possibility and probability of a given question. Based on morphological similarities, it is possible and probable that we are apes, since there is no significant difference in character traits aside from proportions. We have the same bones, the same basic structure, the same dentition, and the same social abilities like recognizing our place in a hierarchy just as they do. This isn't just science says yes, since all of these things are objectively verifiable.
I would agree with you on some of those things. I do, however, believe that there are a lot of differences between humans and apes, as I laid out earlier. I will admit I did a basic interpretation of what it meant by do research. I was unaware that it was not referring to the scientific orthodoxy. I do appreciate the clarification on what it meant by do research, so thank you for bringing that to my attention.
We can't use your I am a monkey hypothesis because it is much too broad. We do have something we can test for, and does meet the criteria to be falsifiable. If, as you likely maintain, we share no relationship with apes, then we should be able to look for something in their DNA and in our own, and not find it in ours. So we can say that as a hypothesis, if humans and apes are unrelated, we should find no similar strains of DNA between humans and apes. But we can refine this further to look for specific genes that are responsible for things that we do not exhibit and would have no reason to have.
I want to say something about DNA while you're on the subject. Now, we both know that all DNA contains adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. So straight off the bat, all DNA is already similar. But then you talk about if we find strands of genes that are not exhibited in humans but are still found in their DNA. So basically vestigial structures on a molecular scale. Strands of DNA that you claim used to serve a purpose but no longer do. Evolutionists love to bring up that whales have hip bones and humans have an appendix. My response is the presence of these things does not prove that they served a purpose. It's possible that whales' hip bones actually do serve some purpose and we just don't understand it yet. And in terms of the human appendix, it's been theorized that it may aid in digestion of raw meat and be linked to our immune system. But as for your main point about vestigial structures in our DNA, this does not mean that we are related to them. But I'm going to go ahead and let you present your evidence. Let's take a look.
Specifically, we will look for MYH16, which codes for the protein known as myosin heavy chain 16. This protein is key in forming those large masticatory muscles in apes, and since we don't have them, we can now construct a very specific hypothesis, which will be this. If humans and apes are unrelated, we should not be able to find the MYH16 gene in human DNA. Very specific, testable, and falsifiable. So how do we test it? Easy. We run a sequence of the specific section that has that gene and see if it pops up, which we've already done, and it does pop up in our DNA. In humans, there is a mutation in that gene that affects the way it forms myosin heavy chain 16 proteins. The gene is there, it makes a protein, but that protein doesn't work in us, and is one of the things that allowed us to develop our greatest asset, our brains.
So I've already laid out my problem with this evidence, but I'll go into more detail. I don't disagree with the result of the experiment. If you're saying that the gene mentioned is in us and apes, I will take your word for it. I do disagree that because that gene is found in both humans and apes, that somehow means that we are related. I want to read an excerpt from this article about how human and chimp DNA is not 99% similar. I feel it is relevant to this discussion about the similarities in our genome. In 2007, Science published an article on the similarity of human and chimp DNA titled Relative Differences, the Myth of 1%. Author John Cohen queried the continued use of the 1% figure, citing comparisons following the publication of the draft chimp DNA sequence of around 5%. And yet the 1% myth is perpetuated. In 2012, in the same journal. In 2012, Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins and Jerry Bergman reviewed the published studies comparing human and chimp DNA. When all the DNA is taken into account, and not just the pre-selected parts, they found it is safe to conclude the human-chimp genome similarity is not more than about 87% identical, and possibly not higher than 81%. In other words, the differences are huge, possibly greater than 19%. Indeed, Dr. Tompkins made his own thorough comparison and found that differences to be about 30%. Also, the Y chromosomes found only in males are radically different, contrary to evolutionist expectations. And I can probably already guess that you don't like this excerpt because it comes from a creationist website, meaning that it is automatically uncredible. So I found this video by a fake science YouTube channel that you would probably love, called Minute Physics. In this video, they admit that they ignore about 40% of our genomes that are different, and compare the other 60% that are similar to arrive at near 99%.
So, yes, we share 99% of our DNA with chimps if we ignore 18% of their genome and 25% of ours.
The link to that video and the article will be in the description.
Combined with the molecular clock, we can trace back the time frame for this mutation, which matches with other independent dating methods like radiometric dating of fossils showing this divergence.
Don't even get me started on radiometric dating. But regarding what you describe as the molecular clock, I believe that is nonsense. You can measure the rate at which mutations happen now, but you can't be sure that at some time mutations were happening at a faster or slower rate. Things you observe today are indicative of what is happening today. They cannot tell you exactly how things happened in the past.
Bear in mind that DNA evidence alone is enough to get a conviction in a court of law and carries enough weight to get a death sentence on its own without anything else. This is the same accuracy as a paternity test.
And obviously I would agree with that. DNA is almost as unique as a fingerprint. This is not what is being discussed. You are not talking about using DNA to make exact matches. You are talking about using DNA to look at similarities and determine a relationship. A paternity test is not the same thing as what you have described. If you use the same standards we use to determine someone is a father, as you did to determine if monkeys were our cousins, you would find the answer is definitively no. Monkeys have giant sections in their DNA that are totally different from ours. But of course, if you ignore these gigantic sections, you will come to the conclusion that we are 98.7% similar. What a joke.
So yes, we can construct valid hypotheses and experiments to prove common descent and that evolution is not only science, but an indisputable fact of biology with more evidence supporting it than any other scientific theory.
As I've already laid out, I disagree that it proves common descent. I will concede that the mechanism to an extent appears to be valid, but I would disagree on the historical aspect that evolution describes.
Even if it were proven wrong tomorrow, another theory would have to be put up in its place. That explains everything it did not account for and all the data that it did already account for, while being testable and falsifiable itself.
That theory will be creationism. I hope that this happens in my lifetime. Creation explains everything so much better than evolution ever will, and I know that eventually the world will know the truth about the origin of life on Earth.
The Watchmaker Argument. I am sure I have covered this in another video, but it seems like it could use a more personal touch in this case. So how do I put this? Yes, a watch, a car, a building, or whatever other man-made examples of engineering we have does require a designer. The key point this argument omits is that those things are not alive. They cannot reproduce naturally on their own like life can. They do not experience mutation or selective pressures like life does. Life does not require a designer, and one is not indicated anywhere. If there was a designer indicated, I would concede that point, and we would not be having this particular discussion.
This really seems to me to be a distinction without a difference. So everything requires a designer except life? Even if I give you that, what about viruses? Evolution claims that viruses are not alive because they cannot reproduce without a host. How long have viruses been around? Where did they come from? Were they around when the first amoeba spontaneously formed in the middle of the ocean? Did they come after? They couldn't have existed before because they didn't have a host. Viruses themselves are evidence of design. They are distinct from nature, and from the evolutionist worldview, they are not alive. So I will be expecting you to concede that viruses at least indicate that a creator might have been involved. I don't expect you to admit that viruses were created, obviously, but I do feel that the existence of viruses at least raises some questions that evolution doesn't have answers for.
Even if I concede that a designer kick-started the universe or made the first cells, which I don't due to a lack of evidence, that still does nothing to disprove evolution. If there were any evidence against evolution, and I am aware of none, that is not simultaneously evidence of a designer. You need both if you want to say that creation is a better model.
Okay, challenge accepted. I will add 2 videos to my list. One will be proving that evolution is totally fabricated, at least as far as the historical aspect of it goes, and another proving that creation is an undeniable fact. Expect those videos sometime in the near future. And I want to respond to your last statement because I think it is pretty much exactly what I want to say to you.
The length of this is not deliberate, but it was necessary. I have unfortunately only been able to cover some of the things briefly, so if you want me to expand on anything, let me know.
I would also like to apologize for the length of this video. If you managed to watch all this, and you have any questions, or require any clarifications, let me know. I gotta say, I really enjoyed your video. Disagreements aside, it was well researched. You're well spoken, and the video was well edited. Your videos are pretty much superior to my videos in almost every way, but hopefully not for too long. I would like to publicly thank you for recommending a free-to-use video editing software. I'm able to do so much more than I was before thanks to you. Thank you for taking the time to respond to my video in a reasonable way, and I think I actually learned a few things. I feel I've said everything that needs to be said. Anyone that watched this video, I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you did, and follow me on Twitter. Thank you.